Good afternoon. Could I mention that I intend this afternoon to adjourn a little earlier than usual at about 10 to 4. So, Ms. Graham, can we aim to take the 15-minute break at about 2:45 and then sit again between 3 o'clock and 10 to 4, depending obviously on you finding a suitable break point in the evidence. So please continue with the evidence now.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you some more questions about the arrangements that were being made in Kirkcaldy Police Office at the time and what had been happening that morning on the 3rd of May. This is against the background we've been talking about the minutes of the Gold Group meeting, which was at around 11:30 in the morning. I'm particularly interested in the arrangements in relation to Colette Bell. And we've heard that Colette Bell was the partner of Mr. Bio, and she had recently had a baby, and that was a babe in arms of weeks old and being breastfed. I think we touched on her name and your awareness of her within the minutes before lunch. We've heard that Colette Bell had been taken to Kirkcaldy Police Office. I'm wondering, you said before lunch you were aware that Colette Bell was being questioned by the police. You knew she was in the police office at that time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
What were your expectations in relation to how she was going to be dealt with by police officers in Kirkcaldy?
She's a relative, so I would expect her to give details about other relatives and given whatever information was available at that stage.
We've heard that she was asked to go to Kirkcaldy Police Office and wanted her mum to go with her to help with her baby at that time, and she felt that the officers weren't, if I can summarise that evidence, they weren't very keen on that idea. She felt there was some resistance. Did you expect her to be taken to Kirkcaldy Police Office with her baby?
Well, I don't know the circumstances of that, but if she wanted to go to the police office and take her baby with her, then that's absolutely fine. I mean, it's that's. I don't see any issue with that. If she wanted her mother to be there, I don't see any issue with that either. I mean, she's coming there as a member of the family, basically.
We've heard it suggested by one witness that there were maybe nicer facilities in a family-friendly suite elsewhere in Fife that she could have been taken to. The same witness also suggested that perhaps she could have been taken to the home of a family member and spoken to there. Would you have had any difficulty with either of those options?
No, not at all.
Do you have any concern about a young mother being asked to go to a police station to speak to police officers in the circumstances she was in that day?
Yeah, well, it depends on what it is that they want her to come to the police office for. So if it's to clarify a few points or whatever, then I think that's absolutely fine. If it's more detailed than that, then I would expect it to be somewhere that's much more conducive to what's happening. So.
We've heard that they delivered the death message to Miss Bell at Kirkcaldy Police Office and then asked for a detailed statement from her, which took a number of hours. Do you have concerns about that approach?
Well, it would be much better not to have taken a detailed statement at that point, but they would need some basic details, but not a detailed statement.
And what sort of basic details would be appropriate?
Next of kin. I think she had reported them as being missing. The details about that. Get an understanding of the background.
And is there any reason why those couldn't be taken either at a family member's home or a family-friendly suite elsewhere?
Not that I can think of, no.
In terms of taking basic details, would it have been necessary to take those at a police station?
No, I don't think so.
We've also heard evidence that in delivering the death message to Miss Bell, that one of the officers who did so said that he was, it was a direction, I'm reading from what he said, it was a direction from our supervisors that we weren't to mention anything to do with police contract until it was properly investigated. And that was relayed to them by the detective sergeant who was in their senior in rank. Can you tell us what views you have about that?
Yeah, my view is straightforward. She ought to have been told. There's absolutely no point whatsoever in not telling her, because she's going to find out it from other sources in any event, so better coming from the police service, being upfront about what's happened, being honest.
And what would the advantages be to being honest about that?
Well, I don't know exactly when she found out, but she would find out she would have enough people on the ground that would be able to tell her exactly what happened. So the advantage would be that it came directly from Police Scotland.
Other officers have given evidence about concerns that it would damage the relationship with the investigation and the officers involved in the investigation and the trust they would have in Police Scotland. Do you agree that not telling the truth could have those implications?
I absolutely agree. It feels like if that's the case, it feels like we've got something to hide when we shouldn't have.
And in terms of responsibility for delivering the death message, who on the ground in Police Scotland would be responsible for that? Who would be in charge of that?
Well, the SIO would direct someone, detective officers, to deliver the death message, and they should be separate from flows. So flows should be deployed once the death message has.
And just to be clear, so you understand the evidence we've heard that Pat Campbell had no involvement in this,
Right.
but that D.I. Robson at that time was involved. So when you say the SIO would, if Pat Campbell wasn't in position at that stage, would you?
Well, so it's the relevant SIO, so as I said earlier, Robson was the initial SIO, and then Pat Campbell came in and took over. So I don't know exactly when that happened, but if D.I. Robson was the SIO at that point, then he would direct that the death message was delivered.
Thank you. Can I ask you to go back to the minutes, please? So these are the minutes of the first Gold Group meeting, PS 06491, and I'm interested now in item 6 on the agenda, community issues. And you'll see this is Safer Communities, and it's spoken to by Chief Inspector Shepherd. Allocated to Chief Inspector Shepherd, who was to make local elected members aware and also liaise with Fife Migrant Forum and the Independent Advisory Group. Community impact was to be considered, including community reassurance. And then there was a request to be made. Can you tell us if more could have been done in relation to dealing with issues, community issues?
Well, I suppose more can always be done. Perhaps as a police service we can't do enough in terms of community relations, but that was the starting point at the first Gold Group meeting, was to begin to engage with communities, to understand what the communities were, and to engage with other relevant bodies around about Fife at that stage. But this potentially could have community issues right across the whole of Scotland, the whole of the UK. So we would be looking for, and why it's got safer communities there, and Chief Inspector Shepherd, is that there would be an expectation of Chief Inspector Shepherd that she would deliver on a local basis. But there's also, so safer communities came under my remit, and they would have a national remit in terms of understanding communities right across the whole country, and delivering exactly, or engaging with the communities and understanding exactly what the issues would be in terms of this incident more broadly than Fife.
We've heard some evidence that there was monitoring being done in relation to social media. Is that something that Police Scotland did at the time in relation to monitoring community issues?
Well, so there'd be, it wouldn't necessarily be community issues, but they would monitor in terms of social media and understand whether issues were bubbling onto the surface as far as the communities were concerned.
Okay. Who would have been doing the monitoring of social media?
So that would have been, via SCD, and I'm trying to reflect now for that. But that would have been done centrally, having a look in general terms about from a social media perspective of whether there were any issues bubbling that were of concern. And
in terms of what you were advised of at the first Gold Group meeting, were there concerns about social media or community issues bubbling away?
At the first Gold Group meeting, I don't think so. I mean, these are all just making sure that we've got the right people in the right place, understanding what's going on, and understanding what the temperature is with communities in Fife and also external to Fife.
Now, we've heard from a number of officers who, in summary, have said they had very little or perhaps no contact with black people in the community in Kirkcaldy. And I wonder if you could help us understand, in terms of your role and your interest in addressing community issues as the Gold Commander, what factors were you thinking about in terms of engagement with the community and improving relations with the community at this time?
Well, so the first thing would be in terms of engagement, understanding what the issues were, and then dealing with these issues as they manifested themselves. So an expectation that Chief Inspector Shepherd was engaging with elected members and others, including the Fife Migrant Forum, and any other forum that would reach out to the various communities that would be impacted in relation to this. And as I say, safer communities on a more national basis, doing exactly the same thing.
And did you expect Nicola Shepherd to consider a community impact assessment as part of the strategy for dealing with the community?
Yeah, so between herself and safer communities more broadly, a community impact assessment.
And in relation to the actions taken by Nicola Shepherd, what level of engagement did you expect that she would have with members of the community? Did you expect her to reach out to these independent groups, or?
Well, if she didn't, then to delegate someone else to reach out to them. So there'd be community officers that would be cognisant of who the elected members are and the various communities are, the various community leaders were. So I would expect, so she might herself not be able to do that, but in terms of she would be able to delegate that to other people who had that understanding, who are involved in that on a day-to-day basis.
So I think earlier today you talked about Nicola Shepherd being a bronze commander in relation to community issues, and she would then coordinate that matter and operationally appoint or delegate actions to other officers.
That's it.
Thank you. Can I ask you about staff welfare for a moment? We've talked about Conrad Trickett. This is item 8 on the agenda. We've talked about Conrad Trickett, and we see there allocated to Conrad Trickett and Police Federation reps, and name PC given is given.
Yeah.
Was there an expectation that Police Federation reps would be involved in taking care of staff welfare?
So they would support the staff. The responsibility for staff welfare is Police Scotland, and PC Gibbon would be there to represent the officers and make sure that Police Scotland were actually undertaking that function.
And prior to Conrad Trickett's arrival at Kirkcaldy, who was taking care of staff welfare up till then?
Well, I don't know. I don't know who that was. I mean, that was part of why Conrad Trickett was asked to come and engage and use his expertise in terms of that kind of situation where we had a number of officers looking after their welfare. So up until that point that he arrived, it would be local supervisors, but that's the point that, from my perspective, that when he engaged, that's the point that we should be seriously looking at all the various issues that I've already spoken about, including welfare.
And we've heard that there wasn't anyone from Police Scotland supervising the officers in the canteen prior to Conrad Trickett arriving and taking on the role of post-incident manager. Yeah. So were you aware that nobody was supervising?
Well, I think that was my concern when we appointed Conrad Trickett, was to make sure that, because at that stage it felt like the officers were in the canteen on their own, and we just needed to, as I said before, get a grip of that. So from a number of different stances that I've already outlined, including their welfare, so I felt that was the best option at that time.
But in any event, I think you've said Police Scotland have an obligation to have regard to staff welfare.
Yes.
And I think we've heard that SPF have some sort of statutory remit to have regard to welfare of officers as well.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Can we move on to number 9, resources? And we see there the names Bowl and Shepherd. And the phrase business continuity. Can I ask you, did you consider at this stage, in considering business continuity, the issue of conflict or potential conflict arising between officers who were maybe part of the investigation or being involved in the investigation, being from Fife, and officers who had been at Hayfield Road, being Kirkcaldy Fife police officers? Did you consider that as part of your arrangements for business continuity?
Sorry.
So it's a long question. When you were thinking about business continuity,
Yes.
Was one of the factors that you considered the issue of conflict or potential conflict? Because the officers who had been involved in the events at Hayfield Road were from Fife. They were Kirkcaldy officers. And the question of whether officers being brought in to help with the investigation were also from Fife.
Well, potentially there is, but you need to use the staff that you've got available to you at that stage, and so we as a service were being investigated by the PERC, You know, so at that stage, as I've said on a number of occasions, it's about stabilising everything that we've got. It's about gathering whatever information we can, and then it's about handing over to the PIR to carry out the investigation. So at that point in time, you know, the officers from Fife who were there and available were the best people, I think, to carry that. Otherwise, we would have had to have officers attend from potentially E Division, C Division, D Division, which would take some considerable time. So I know it's a fine balance, but it's having confidence that where we were at that time, we could be objective enough, we could gather the information, we could secure the information and productions and CCTV with the sound knowledge that the PIRC would at some stage take over and lead the investigation.
So there was never a point where the Gold Group said no officers from Fife have to be involved?
No, not at all.
And would that have been possible given the resources issue?
Well, we could have got officers, as I said, from D Division, Dundee and Perth, or E Division Edinburgh and the surrounding areas, or C Division Central Scotland, Stirling, Falkirk. But that would take some time to draw the resources to get them to attend in the numbers that we would require to undertake that at that time. So, you know, we could have considered that at a later stage, and if we were continuing the investigation, you know, to be impartial, then it would have been better to have undertaken that. But one of the things that is that the MITs were involved, so many of them wouldn't be from Fife itself.
So looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think there would have been benefit in requiring non-Fife officers to be involved with the investigation, only non-Fife officers?
I'm not sure that would be possible at that stage, to be honest. I mean, we needed to carry, you know, needed to secure production, scene, CCTV, you know, and that was always going to be carried out by local officers who were there on the ground. Then the MIT becomes involved, so they would be independent. They, you know, they might, in the MITs there might be one or two officers from Fife, but the vast majority would be from elsewhere. So, and you know, the consideration at the end of the day was that the PIRC were going to take over the inquiry, so it would be them that were investigating certainly the more sensitive parts of the inquiry.
Right. Can I ask you about a potential conflict between Police Scotland officers and PIRC officers or investigators?
Right.
And did you know that certain people from PIRC had been former police officers?
Yes.
Did that cause you any concern?
Well, you know, when PIRC was put together, which was at the beginning of Police Scotland, then they drew from police officers across, or retired police officers across the country. So, but they've been involved in quite a few investigations, and there was no concern whatsoever in terms of how objective, how impartial they could be, how they carried out their investigations, how they reported on Police Scotland, and there were quite a few investigations before this, which will be available. So I didn't really have any concerns that they were police officers. At the end of the day, you're looking for someone who's a good investigator, is going to be impartial, is going to carry out the investigation in a thorough manner and understand what the issues are.
And were you satisfied that the investigators who came from PIRC on the 3rd of May to deal with this incident were good investigators who could be impartial and thorough?
Yeah, well, I've got no reason to. I mean, if they come to the inquiry, you'll be able to ask them their background and their experience. But some of them I knew. They had investigative background. They would have had training from the PIRC, but the most important thing is for them to get on the ground and to lead the inquiry.
And I think in particular you said you knew John McSporran, who we've heard was an investigator for PIRC.
Yeah,
and I think you say you'd previously line managed him, is that correct?
That's right, yes. And Billy Little, who no doubt we'll speak about later, line managed him. And Keith Harrower, but I don't recollect line managing him.
But you knew him?
But I knew him.
Can I ask you about item 11, please? Media Strategy Communications Plan. This was obviously spoken to by Kate Finlay, whose name we saw earlier.
Yep.
Were you aware at that stage, you've obviously said in the minutes it says update that circumstances of incident were in public domain via social media, including that an officer had been stabbed. Was it explained to you how that information had found its way into the public domain?
No.
Did you ever find out how that
No,
had come?
I don't think so.
I mean, who could have shared that information with the press at that time?
Well, I don't know.
Before we leave these minutes, I'd like to talk to you about, again, about something to do with the statements. We touched on this earlier. We spoke about operational statements. Can I ask you to look at paragraphs 164 and 165 of your inquiry statement, please?
Yeah.
And you'll see in the inquiry statement what you've been asked here. I've been asked who was in charge of ensuring the officers completed their paperwork on their return, this being their operational statements, their notebooks, use of force forms and any use of spray forms. The officers themselves are responsible. Their supervisor is also responsible for making sure these documents are being completed. The duty sergeant, not as much anymore, but it used to be the practice. When I joined in 83, a sergeant would go round twice on their shift and ask to see your notebook, and they'd put a signature in the notebook. They checked times and ensured that it's completed to a satisfactory degree. They also ensured it's contemporaneous. We've moved away from that over the years. That practice has ceased long ago. I'm interested in this because we did hear from witnesses who said they thought that perhaps sergeants had a responsibility to make sure that paperwork was completed. And does that remain, or did that remain the position in 2015, even though this particular practice about signing notebooks had fallen by the wayside?
Yeah, I mean, the officers themselves have a responsibility to complete the documentation, but their sergeants and their inspector should be making sure that they're actually completing the paperwork.
And does that include use of force forms and use of spray forms?
It would, yes.
And we've heard evidence that these forms should be completed by the end of the officers' shifts. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
Unless there's particular reasons it can't
exactly.
be done. And that if they can't be done for any particular reason, it should be done as soon as possible. Is
that's right.
accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah.
Was there a way in 2015 that if officers failed to complete any of the paperwork, such as notebooks, use of force forms or use of spray forms, that Police Scotland could have requested that be done or completed?
Well, I would expect it to be done through their supervisors.
Right. And when you say done through their supervisors, what would you expect the supervisor to do?
Ask them.
And that would be the sergeant in charge?
That would be the sergeant. And then if it was appropriate, instruct them.
And tell us what the difference is between asking and instructing.
So asking is what you're doing at this moment in time, asking questions, but instructing is telling people to do what it is that you want them to do.
And if the sergeant in charge of the response team has been engaged in the incident, who would the responsibility fall to?
It would go up the command chain to an inspector.
Would that be the PIO, the inspector involved, or would it be someone else?
Well, if there's so I don't know the structure for Fife that morning now, but normally there would be police constables on the street. There would be a sergeant in charge of, or several sergeants perhaps, and then an inspector sitting above that with responsibility for the whole group. Now I don't know if that was what it was in Fife on that day, so I probably can't answer your question as well as I might do. But it would, if the sergeant required to fill in the forums, then it would naturally go up the chain to the inspector.
And if it wasn't done by the inspector, or the forms still weren't completed, who would then hear about it?
Well, so the SIO would want to see and understand these forums, and they would become productions at some stage in terms of the inquiry. So it would be, if the SIO wanted to have these, it would be the SIO instructing the officers to complete the various documentation.
And in terms of the circumstances in May 2015, on this particular day, the 3rd, is there any reason why the SIO could not have instructed officers to complete use of force forms if they'd used force, or use of spray forms equally if officers had used sprays?
No, I don't think there's any reason.
And if they had declined to complete those forms, use of force or use of spray, despite an instruction from the SIO, what would have then happened in consequence?
Well, so potentially it would be a disciplinary matter, but it's back to what I've already said, is, what do we want to achieve in terms of all of this? And we want operational statements. We would want all of this, but if they aren't supplied, then it's back to how you compel officers to provide all of that detail. And at some stage, the officers are going to provide the detail that's required. So it's one of those balances that you could go down the route of lawful order, disciplinary, but you then begin to alienate the officers when actually what you want to do is get a statement and further statements at some later stage that gives a real understanding of what happened in the incident.
We've heard these forms were never completed.
Right.
But the officers did give operational statements on the 4th of June 2015.
Yeah.
Can I ask, whose responsibility would it be for ensuring that these forms were ultimately completed by the officers?
Well, so I mean, it would be in terms of the local supervisors, but I suppose I don't know this, but if the statements that were given contained the detail of what would be in the use of force forums and the spray forums, then presumably that supersedes. But I don't know the level of that level of detail. So,
is it possible to say, well, I've given my operational statement, it's got all the detail you need, so I'm not going to complete these particular forms? Is that a sufficient explanation?
I mean, if all the detail is there in the statements that they provided, then it would be better. There's no question for them to have completed the forms, but the argument's going to be the detail, and all the detail that's required is in their operational statement, or the statement they provided presumably to the PIRC at some stage, then that's probably suffice.
So is it possible that a decision could be taken at some stage to not pursue any disciplinary proceedings in relation to the failures to complete use of force forms or use of spray forms because the statements are sufficiently detailed?
Yes, that's correct.
And who would take that decision if that was a decision that was taken?
Well, so it would. So I don't think that anybody went down the route of discipline at this time. As I said before, once you go down the route of discipline, you're potentially alienating people that you want to actually get a full statement from about all the circumstances. So it'll be a real balance of what you do.
And if someone was looking at this situation and deciding whether to, say, after the 4th of June when statements were available, someone's looking at it and saying, we've still not got these use of force forms, use of spray forms, we have to decide what we're going to do about that. Who would be taking that decision? Either disciplinary or we're happy where we are?
Well, the ultimate decision, if it was ever reported to him, would be to the Deputy Chief Constable designate, would be Neil Richardson, I think, at that stage. So he would make an ultimate decision about discipline, but that would have to be reported up through the chain of command to him that there were omissions in what was supplied.
And who would be monitoring whether these forms were completed or not?
Well, I mean, in terms, so once all of this is handed over to the PIRC, then I would expect the PIRC would be looking for these forms and the statements. So I assume that the PIRC would report back to the organisation that these forms weren't submitted, if in fact that's what they believed was pertinent. But so I don't know the detail of that or what they believed.
We've not heard from PIRC yet about the circumstances to do with that. But after the 4th of June, they had the statements from the officers. They took statements. Yeah. So it would be at some point after that they could consider whether they wanted the forms as well.
Yes, and it would be in the round of their investigation in terms of what was expected of the police officers and the investigation. So,
in relation to the forms in particular, would there have been any role for professional standards?
Yes. So,
and the failure to complete those forms?
Potentially there would be. So,
how would that arise?
Well, I assume the PIRC would report back to the force, and then it would go through professional standards, and then it would go to ultimately potentially go to the deputy.
And would there be anyone with a role in Police Scotland who would have responsibility for monitoring the completion of these forms, regardless of PIRC?
Well, it's a fine balance in terms of allowing the PIRC to get on with their investigation and Police Scotland not becoming involved in the various aspects of that. So I think it's allowing the PIRC to get on with their investigation and then report back in terms of whatever omissions there were in terms of how the police officers went about their duties.
Did this come to the attention of the Gold Group at any time? The fact that these forms hadn't been completed?
I can't remember now, to be honest. But
do you remember any discussion about?
No,
the forms?
I don't remember. I don't remember any discussion about the forms whatsoever.
And the inquiry haven't seen any forms. It would appear they were never completed.
Okay.
Were there any obligations to monitor these things and have these forms audited or completed as part of monitoring for Police Scotland?
I don't think. I mean, once we come to have the full statements and the detail, then presumably it was felt that they were superfluous in terms of, if you've got the detail, then you just move on from that.
I'm interested in the impact, if any, of the privilege against self-incrimination. Now, we've heard that some of the officers were understood that the legal advice was not to give operational statements. Concern, I think was mentioned earlier this morning, that their status might change from witness to suspect. And was there any discussion at the Gold Group meetings or as part of your role about this privilege that was being relied on not to give operational statements?
No, not at all.
Was there any discussion that you remember about involving professional standards or Craig Blackhall in relation to looking at these matters?
Well, so professional standards were briefed and were involved from the beginning. But, what specific matters that they were briefed on, I don't know. They were obviously informed about the incident, and so they would have an interest as it unfolded, and
We've heard that professional standards may have a dual role in relation to wanting awareness about possible criminal proceedings against police officers, but also being interested in possible misconduct proceedings. Were you aware of any discussions going on with professional standards about that dual role or how matters would be resolved?
No, not at that time, no.
At any time at all?
No, I can't remember being involved in any discussion with professional standards about that.
Would you have expected professional standards to consider the possibility of disciplinary proceedings at some stage?
Well, it depends on what comes back from the investigation. So I don't know the level of detail that professional standards had at that stage.
Once officers have, leaving aside the forms, the use of force forms for the moment, once the officers had given their operational statements on the 4th of June, or they'd given statements to PERC, I should say, on the 4th of June, they've not completed the use of force forms, but they've given their detailed statements on the 4th of June. Who would be responsible? We've heard that they have to justify using force, and each officer has to do that.
Yep.
Who's responsible for considering their statement and saying that is a justification for the use of force, or it's not a justification?
Also, the statements were given to PERC, I assume.
Yes, they were.
So, Police Scotland would have no sight of the operational statements, or the statements anyway, at that stage, and we wouldn't expect to have. And it would be a decision for the PERC in terms of if they noted any omissions in terms of what the police or the officers had undertaken at that time.
So even if Police Scotland had wanted to take that forward, you didn't have access to the statement, so you couldn't then consider whether it was a justified use of force or not. That wouldn't have been possible.
Well, I mean, we need to, the PERC need to be independent. Police Scotland oughtn't be involved in steering, directing, wanting to see statements or whatever. It's allowing the PERC to get on with their investigation and then to report in terms of what's happened in terms of the investigation, and then to report back in terms of that. They would report to the Procurator Fiscal at one level and then back to the force.
Right. It's 2:45. Could you give me a moment, please?
Yeah.
And I'd like to address the chair separately, if I may. I wonder if that might be an appropriate moment for us to have the mid-afternoon break.
Yes, we'll stop for 15 minutes. Thank you. Miss Graham.
Thank you very much. Can I see yours? We know that individual officers have to justify every use of force. And is that something that Police Scotland will monitor or make sure that it's done by police officers?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
And who is responsible for ensuring that individual officers justify every use of force?
So it would go up through line management, and I assume ultimately PSD, but I'm not sure at this point, to be honest.
All right. You said before the break it's allowing the PERC to get on with their investigation and then to report in terms of what's happened.
Yeah.
What's happened in terms of the investigation, and then to report back in terms of that. They would report to the Procurator Fiscal at one level and then back to the force. So I said to you earlier, statements were given to PERC by the officers on the 4th of June 2015. And we heard Police Scotland never saw those statements. So you would never have had the information that would have allowed Police Scotland to determine whether the use of force was justified. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now, we've not heard from PERC yet, but I understand that the PERC did report their investigation to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, but that the PERC report was never sent to Police Scotland.
Okay.
Did you know that?
No.
Because what seems to be the case here is that although there was a report to the Fiscal, there was never a report sent to Police Scotland. Police Scotland would never have had access to that report with the conclusions of their investigation. So from a Police Scotland perspective, there's no statements ever been seen by Police Scotland, no use of force forms, no use of spray forms. So how would Police Scotland satisfy themselves in that particular situation that the officers had justified every use of force or use of spray?
I'm not sure in these circumstances.
Can you think of any other way that Police Scotland could satisfy themselves about use of force without those documents?
No. I mean, Police Scotland would then have to carry out their own investigation in terms of, and be potentially undermining the PERC's investigation. So it's as I said already, it's a fine balance. But it's allowing the PERC to get on with their investigation without the police seeming to interfere into that investigation, but to support the PERC and everything. But if we got no report back, then we don't know what's in the statements. It's really difficult to take that forward.
So, as things stand, with PERC reporting to the Fiscal but not responding to or reporting to Police Scotland, does that make it very difficult for Police Scotland to assess whether the use of force or use of sprays were justified?
It absolutely does.
And is there any mechanism whereby Police Scotland could have said, we will carry on some sort of parallel investigation or into the use of force?
I don't think there is. I mean, I would have expected that if the Crown had concerns in relation to the use of force or how that had come about, then that would have been reported back to Police Scotland to carry out an investigation into that. So
you would have perhaps expected communication from the Crown Office to Police Scotland if there were concerns?
Yes.
And had there been communication from Crown Office to Police Scotland about concerns being raised, is that something that Police Scotland could then have investigated themselves?
I would expect that they would have been instructed by the Crown Office to carry out investigation.
Thank you. Now, in relation to specifically use of spray forms, we've heard some evidence about these, that it was a legal requirement, a statutory requirement, that these forms be completed by officers who had discharged sprays. Now, we've heard that there were 3 officers who discharged sprays, CS or PAVA, on the 3rd of May 2015. And in relation to those 3 officers, as I understand it, no forms were completed. So again, with regard to how the police service can monitor the failure to complete those forms, which is a legal requirement, what was being done in Police Scotland in relation to those specific forms, the use of spray forms?
I don't know is the answer to that, but I would have expected that Police Scotland would have awaited the outcome of the investigation, and if that had been highlighted as an issue, because presumably if it's a statutory requirement, then it would require a report to Crown Office, but presumably Crown Office didn't raise any concerns, or it wasn't in the public interest, but that would be a question for them in terms of the completion of the forms.
Now, we've heard evidence that in terms of the procedure that was in place in 2015, the use of spray forms ought to have been completed within 24 hours of the discharge of the spray, and that form would have then been sent to PERC. Within that period, that timescale, your Gold Commander, did anyone from PERC come to you and say, we have noticed that these use of spray forms haven't been completed within that 24-hour period?
No.
There's a statutory requirement that they be completed.
Yeah.
We want you to go and get these forms completed from the officers.
No.
At any time when you were Gold Commander, did the Crown come to you and say, officers haven't completed these forms, would you please make arrangements to get them?
No.
At any point, did you consider going or delegating to someone to go to the officers and say, we instruct that you complete these forms, the use of spray?
No, so as I said earlier, my role is strategic, and my expectation is that all of these tasks will be carried out if they can be carried out, so I don't recollect an issue being raised with me in terms of the non-completion of the forums, and I don't see that as being my role to actually proactively go and understand why they aren't, or to instruct, or whatever. So,
whose role would it have been to come or to speak about the use of spray forms to try and get them?
Well, so it would be, if it was a concern, and it ought to have been escalated through the chain of command to understand and to instruct to take the completion of the forums.
And that chain of command would be the sergeant, the inspector, and moving up the normal chain of command.
That's correct.
As Gold Commander, could you have influenced that or assisted with endeavours to obtain these use of spray forms?
Well, short of going and ordering people to do that, you've got an expectation, a reasonable expectation, that people will undertake what they, what their responsibilities are, without me having to check. I can't check on every single aspect of this. I mean, it's and so. I could, if it was brought to my attention, but back to what I said already, what you'd want to do is try to ask people to complete forms and statements and whatever else without, at that stage, alienating them until the perk of the opportunity to come and take up the investigation and lead on that investigation.
If Pat Campbell had come to you and said, I'm getting no statements, no initial accounts, no basic facts, I've got no use of force forms, I've got no use of spray forms,
Yeah.
I would like something to be done at the very least about the use of spray forms.
Yeah.
Is that something the Gold Group could have assisted with?
Well, it could have been discussed at the Gold Group, but then it would, we would delegate it back down to someone to actually tell the officers to submit the forms.
Did you know at the first Gold Group meeting that sprays had been discharged?
I think yes, I would think so, yeah.
Thank you. Could professional standards have assisted in any way in gaining the use of spray forms?
Well, it's back to what I said at the very beginning. It's how do you compel officers who are refusing to give statements, as I understood it, and presumably they don't want to complete the use of force forms or the spray forms because that will give detail of what it is that happened at that time. So, we could have professional standards involved. We could have lawful orders from their own line management. They could have me giving an instruction. But at the end of the day, how do you compel an individual who's concerned about what's happening? I mean, they're not any different to any other member of the public in terms of all of that. So it's, how do you compel them to complete the forms or to give the statements? I'm just not quite sure about that.
And if the officers are told they're witnesses and not suspects, does that make any difference to what you just said about not wanting to compel them?
So I don't think that I'm saying we don't want to, ultimately we would want them to complete their operational statements and the various forums, but if they're that concerned about and they're refusing to do that, then what I'm saying is that it's really difficult to know how you're going to compel them to do that. So you could go down disciplinary route and they still refuse, and then we embark on a route where we alienate the officers when actually what we want them to do is provide an operational statement that gives the detail of what's actually happened, and gives us the best possible opportunity of understanding what's happened at the incident.
Sorry, I may have been mistaken. It may not be 24 hours, it may be 48 hours. I don't suppose that'll make any difference whatsoever. If the officers are told you are witnesses, not suspects, and if at a later stage, after statements have been given, they're told there's not going to be a prosecution, does that make any difference to the police? Could they go back and say, can we have these forms, or can we get completed forms? Or would that be seen as well as this is a matter for PERC and we should leave all of that to PERC?
I think that's part of the PERC investigation led by the Crown. So presumably, Police Scotland could go back, but we didn't have the statements and didn't have an understanding of exactly what that was. The report was directly to Crown, so it's difficult to understand how Police Scotland could intervene into that and then presumably carry out a further investigation, not knowing the details of the previous investigation. So to some degree we were beyond that point, I would think.
Had you ever, in your career, come across a situation where officers declined to provide operational statements or to complete forms?
No, I don't think so.
Never?
No, I can't think of a situation where they have, but of course there might be, but in most instances where, instances where there's police shootings, whatever, my experience has been that the officers have given operational statements in a later stage, either given statements to, as far as police shootings are concerned, that was Strathclyde Police when I was part of Strathclyde Police, so that would have been initially an internal Strathclyde Police and then handed to an external force, so 2 police shootings, and the individuals fortunately didn't die, but they were investigated by Lutheran Borders, one of them, and Grampian, the other. So,
had you ever been involved in disciplinary proceedings being taken against officers because of failures to complete paperwork?
yeah, well, so I was the Deputy Chief Constable at Strathclyde Police, so at some stage, but not, I don't recollect in terms of use of force forms and the spray forms, but in terms of other paperwork, not submitting cases to the fiscal, whatever that happened to be, then yes, to disciplinary cases as far as that was concerned.
In those cases where you were, on the one hand, no doubt keen to get the officers to complete the paperwork, as you were here, keen to get the officers to complete the statements, but the officer had not done so, at what point was the decision taken to pursue disciplinary proceedings for that?
Well, so in terms of failing to submit cases, then it would be on the statutory limit before there was an understanding that that had happened. So it would be a clear case in terms of discipline.
Sorry, can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Well, so if I don't know, you arrest someone for, I don't know, going through a set of traffic lights or whatever, there'd be a statutory limit in terms of the prosecution. So officers, having stopped someone, charges them with failing to stop at a red traffic light and then failing to submit the case in the time limit.
And would the disciplinary procedures be instigated after, say, 6 months after the statutory time limit had expired?
Yeah, well, in most cases, so it would depend. It would depend on the circumstances, but mostly that's how it would come to light that the case hadn't been submitted.
And so, in relation to, say, a use of spray form, where there's a statutory requirement to complete it and a period of time which is given to complete it has elapsed, why would there be no disciplinary proceedings instigated after that?
Well, back to what I said before, this is a fine balance of the PIRC being allowed to get on with their investigation and Police Scotland carrying out an investigation. So it would potentially mean that Police Scotland be carrying out an investigation and the PIRC would be carrying out an investigation at exactly the same time, and the ramifications for that, or the implications for that, are that there would be no public confidence in what the police were doing, and so it needs to be separated. The PIRC need to be allowed to carry on with their investigation and need to be free to take whatever statements and carry out whatever actions they want to carry out. And at some later stage, as I said previously, if there was a report back from either the PIRC or the Crown Office in relation to the evidence that had been gathered, then presumably if it was deemed to be in the public interest, then Police Scotland would have carried out further inquiries in relation to the disciplinary aspects of it.
So if PIRC hadn't existed in May 2015, could Police Scotland have pursued disciplinary proceedings, at least in relation to the use of failure to complete the use of spray forms, shortly after that?
Well, if there was no
timescale?
other investigation,
Yeah.
then yes, of course. So there will be instances where there's sprays being deployed, and then there'll be an expectation from the force that the officer will complete that. Where there isn't an incident like this, though.
Mm-hmm.
So
So if PERC weren't involved in the incident, Police Scotland would have had freedom to consider disciplinary proceedings if an officer fails to complete a use of spray form.
yes, absolutely.
And have you come across any other situations where the existence of PERC and the existence of a a PERC investigation has maybe inhibited or resulted in Police Scotland not considering disciplinary proceedings?
I haven't come across that, because normally, we would get a PERC investigation, then we would get a report coming back from PERC. Well, it depends on the circumstances, obviously, but we'd get a report coming back from the PERC which would outline what the concerns were, and then considerations could at that point be given to disciplinary matters.
So in relation to other incidents, you would hear back from the PERC in relation to their
Yes.
report? And would that report then be considered and acted upon in relation to their findings?
Yes, absolutely.
But it wasn't done here.
Well, I didn't have, you've told me that at this moment in time. I didn't know or understand where exactly the reports went to.
All right, I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the future.
No doubt.
Thank you. Can I move on then, please, and deal with something that happened later in the day? We've heard evidence from a D.S. Dursley, which related to a telephone call that he made to Zaid Saheed. You'll remember, looking at the minutes, it was a priority action to get a statement from Zaid Saheed. And we heard from him that he had a telephone conversation with Mr. Saheed, and at that time Mr. Saheed was at his family home, and D.S. Dursley sent officers to go and pick him up. When he spoke to Mr. Saheed, he explained that the police were concerned for his friend, that's Mr. Bayo. This was round about 11 o'clock, or shortly after 11 o'clock. Concerned for his friend, and the police required to speak to him. And I wonder if you have any concerns about an officer telling Mr. Saheed, who was a good friend of Mr. Bayo, that they were concerned for Mr. Bayo and wanted to speak to him?
It's back to, I think, what we said already. It's a case of they already know what the outcome is, and this should have been up front and told him exactly why they wanted to speak to him.
And what would the benefits to the investigation have been if they had been honest about the fact that Mr. Bayo had died at that point?
Well, in terms of the family, the family and friends, the police would be seen to be upfront, and then they would be able to take a statement with him knowing what the outcome was, or what had happened at the incident, or the police involvement at the incident, I should say.
Right. And do you remember when you were at the first Gold Group meeting, which started at 11:30, if you had any understanding as to why the police wanted to talk to Mr. Zaid Saheed?
No, I can't, but it would be part of the investigation. I don't know exactly.
Do you have any recollection about the family home of Mr. Saheed and why that was later identified as one of the loci?
I don't.
We noted it wasn't noted as a loci
Yeah.
at the first meeting. I'm wondering when you became aware that it had been subsequently identified.
I assume that. Well, I don't know whether it's updated in the second goal group. I can't recollect now, but
We'll come on to that. Were you aware at the time of the first gold group meeting that officers had been sent out to go and collect Mr. Saeed?
No, I don't think so.
Can I ask you about the properties and the loci? Just see. I think the next gold group meeting was at 1440.
Yes.
And I'd like to look at those minutes. PS 07268. The second gold group meeting is at 1440 on the 3rd of May 2015. And again, you were chairing the gold group meeting. I think we heard at this time that Perk had arrived by then. But let's look first of all at item 3 on the agenda. And we see there that loci strategy, this relates to item 3, investigative process. 5 locations were being secured, and it was the same locations as previously noted in the minutes, but this time it included the home address of Mohammed Zahid Saeed. All right. Do you remember when you became aware that the home address or the family home address of Mr. Saeed had been identified as an additional locus?
No, but presumably it's at that meeting, but
when this item on the agenda was mentioned, was there any discussion about issues that had taken place at that address or that home?
I can't recollect now.
Don't remember anything?
No.
We have heard evidence from various witnesses, and I think you touched on it this morning, that the police will either seek the consent of the occupants to seize the property or they will seek a warrant. Is there any other legal basis for a police officer or officers to seize a house?
There may well be, but I can't recollect now.
Do you remember the basis on which police officers could require a person to provide their name, address, date of birth, place of birth, nationality?
Potentially, but yeah, no doubt. I can't specifically remember, but it rings a bell.
I appreciate it's a while since you retired. Do you remember how, if police are seeking consent, that would be recorded by the officers, that they've obtained consent to seize a house, enter a house, search a house even?
Well, it would just be them engaging with the individual and seeking that permission. That would be it. They might record it at a later stage or whatever.
We heard evidence previously on day 38 of the inquiry in February this year from a DC Finch who said he would have it noted in his notebook and get the occupant to sign it. Would that be good practice as far as you remember?
No, that's good practice.
He gave evidence that though he would explain to the witness that they were under no occupant, I should say, they were under no obligation to allow officers to seize, enter, move around the property. Is that something that you would consider good practice?
Yeah.
is it fair to say that if people consent, they can withdraw that consent at any time?
Yeah.
Have you heard of officers having authority, a legal basis for seeking a property that isn't a warrant, that isn't consent, but is something to do with SIO instruction? Is that a basis for seizing, entering and securing a property and maybe searching a property? If the SIO gives you an instruction to do that, is that good enough?
I would no, I don't think so. So, under normal circumstances, you'd be looking for, either a warrant or warrant, if the people were refusing to allow you access.
So, if you go to a house and people refuse,
Yeah.
and do not provide consent, is it then open to the police to go and seek a warrant?
Well, they would have to justify, but they would apply to the procurator fiscal and then to the court, and a warrant would either be agreed or denied.
And if the police can't justify that warrant, they make an application, they can't persuade a sheriff, or the fiscal will refuse
Yeah.
to put it before a sheriff, and the occupants refuse to consent, what do the police do in that situation?
Well, they would need to carry out the investigation and get enough justification for carrying out such a search, and then go and reapply.
So there's nothing to stop police reapplying at a later stage,
No, not
in
at
light of new information
No,
that's
not at all.
maybe come
Yeah.
to light. Is there, or was there in 2015, a common law power to seize properties that you're aware of?
No, I can't recollect.
Right.
Do you mean inside property?
It was, one of the witnesses referred to it as a common law power to seize the property. So not a warrant, not consent, but some other type of common law power.
Can't recollect that.
We also heard from other witnesses that there was emergency powers. For example, if somebody was running off with drugs, that they could enter into a property essentially to chase the perpetrator.
Yes.
Was that a
Yeah,
power
so
that was available?
Yeah, I can't tell you the statute or. But,
No, I won't ask for that. But so there could have been emergency situations which permitted
Yeah.
the police to enter a property.
Yes.
When an officer attends a property, it's to be seized or secured in some way. What instructions would you expect them to be sent with? Would they just be sent with an instruction, go and seize that property, or would the officer expect to be given information about whether there was a warrant, whether they were to secure consent, that type of thing?
Yeah, I would think so, and also what was to be seized.
Right. And what about information about the circumstances? Why the property had been identified,
Yeah.
why it was being seized, why they were looking to enter the property, search the property.
Yeah, that would be good practice, yes.
Would you expect officers to be given that information?
I would, yes.
Would you expect officers to be given no information and just simply told to go and seize a property?
No.
Why not?
Well, so they have to make decisions themselves in terms of what it is that they're carrying out. So having the best possible information, because if they don't get given any information, they don't know why they're seizing the property, they don't know what they're actually looking for, they don't know who they're looking for, they don't know why they're there. They need to know all of these things. Now, of course, if it's an emergency situation and it's someone saying, urgently seize that property for whatever reason, then of course that's a different matter. But otherwise, it would be.
What sort of situation would constitute an emergency? Could you help the chair understand that? Can you give us an example?
Someone's in a house with a firearm, is discharging it, or whoever are likely to discharge it, then so that would be an emergency situation. But there'll be other emergency situations. But so it would be all in its own merits. But
you'll see on the minutes at item 3 that DCI Houston was identified as a crime scene coordinator. Now, I'm interested in that role. Is that different from a crime scene manager? Can you explain the difference?
So there'd be a crime scene manager for each location, and then the coordinator would coordinate all of the managers.
So there's 5 loci identified.
Yeah.
Stuart Houston, DCI Stuart Houston would be the coordinator in relation to all 5.
Yeah.
But each one individually would have a separate manager.
Should
crime
have,
scene manager.
yes.
And was that something that was discussed in any detail?
No.
Were you aware of who the crime scene managers would be?
No.
What would you have expected DCI Houston to be doing in that role?
So just making sure that each location was secured, and then in terms of crime scene protocols, that they would. So if it was about forensics, or if it was about seizure of property, or so coordinating all the resources to make sure that they get the best evidential return from all 5, depending on what it is they're looking from each.
And depending on the circumstances, there might be different approaches taken in relation to each of the 5 loci.
Yes.
Now, in terms of securing authority, or making sure the right authority was in place, obtaining a warrant, or saying this is going to be on the basis of consent, and sharing information about the circumstances as to why they're interested in the property, would it be the crime scene coordinator's role to use a word that we've heard, cascade that information down, or would it be the individual crime scene manager's role to share that information with the officers who are going to be involved operationally in the work?
Well, I don't know exactly what's happened here, but it could be either one. So you would expect the crime scene manager for each property to know and understand exactly what was required, and to cascade that to the officers that were deployed to that location. But of course you could have, and I don't know whether he did or not, but DCI Houston, he could give a briefing to all the people that were involved. So I don't know, that would be a question for himself about exactly how that came about.
So in terms of authority, securing authority for these loci to be secured, seized, entered, searched, we've got the SIO identifying the loci,
Yeah.
and appointing a crime scene coordinator, who in this case was DCI Houston, and then 5 individual crime, or a number of individual crime scene managers in relation to these properties or loci. Who would be responsible? Whose job would it be to make sure that the necessary consent or warrant was in place to secure, enter, search these properties?
So the officers that attended to obtain either the consent or otherwise, if they didn't get consent, then to feed that back up the chain and to look for authority to enter and search.
So in terms of giving an explanation, that would be either the crime scene coordinator or the crime scene manager, would it? And then the individual officers would then have to go and determine if they could rely on consent or they need to go and get a warrant.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
That's correct. So it could be the crime scene coordinator sharing information, or it could be the individual manager.
Yes.
But in terms of making sure if you can't get consent, you need to get a warrant, that would be the officers who are at the door of the house speaking to the occupier.
Yep.
Who would be responsible in terms of sharing information about, we'll come on to this, but a number of occupiers might have said, well, how long do you need the house for? Who would be responsible for sharing information about that? Would it be the crime scene coordinator or the crime scene manager? Or would that be something that you'd expect individual officers on the ground to respond to?
Well, so the individual officers on the ground in consultation, I assume, with the crime scene manager would know and understand how long it was likely to take to complete the process that they wanted to undertake. So between them, they would be able to inform the occupant of roughly, so some of these things will take much longer because they come across, whatever it is, and then that has to be dealt with. So that might extend the time that they're within a property.
So if an occupier says to a police officer, how long is this going to take? How long do I have to be out of the house? Would you expect that officer to then contact the office and speak to the crime scene manager or the crime scene coordinator and discuss it with them? What would you expect that officer to do?
Well, I think that officer, would know roughly how long it's going to be. Is it going to be 4 hours, or is it going to be a day, or is it going to be a couple of days? So, as I said before, you couldn't be accurate, so you couldn't say it's going to be 1 hour 30 minutes or whatever. But you might be able to say, well, it'll be the morning, or it'll be the full day, or we might need to hold the property for a couple of days.
And who would have provided the officer with that type of information?
Well, the officer themselves, that's going to the property, knowing what it is that they're looking for, should be in a position to understand how long it's likely to take.
We've heard that at this stage anyway, investigations were at an early stage. And what happens if this investigation's at an early stage and the police are attempting to secure addresses, but they don't really know what's required at that stage? What information could be given to occupiers in that situation?
Well, they would have some indication of what they're looking for, as I said, and it would be based on that initial information. But as I said, it could be extended. So, depending on what they come across, depending on what they find, depending on what they're looking for, then they may have to go back and say, we need the house for another 2 days or 3 days or whatever. But it would be dictated by what it is they come across, and from their own expertise and knowledge, and presumably most of them will have undertaken that kind of seizure and search previously.
You think that the individual officers would have had some indication of what they were looking for, even at that stage?
Yes, I mean, there must have been, you'd expect there's some justification for these locations being identified, and if that's the case, then, what is it that
All right.
I don't, so I suppose if you didn't know an awful lot, you could send someone along and seize the property and then garner some information at a later stage. But that there must have been a reason for identifying the properties in the first place. So there would be some reason and some indication of what was required at the beginning. That, of course, that might extend as the either forensic search or search of the property ensues. But at the beginning, they must have some notion of roughly how long it will take.
And was the justification for each of those addresses brought to the attention of the Gold Group meetings? Obviously, Hayfield Road and Victoria Hospital is quite clear. But what about the address of Martin Dick the home address of Mohammed Zaid
No,
Sahid
there would be
and Colette Bell's
no,
address?
there would be no great detail about any of that. So it would be purely and simply outlining his strategy and telling the goal group what locations are going to be secured. But I don't think it was any broader than that.
And would it be for the SIO to consider the justification for securing properties?
Yes.
Either at that meeting or any subsequent meeting, was it ever drawn to the Gold Group's attention that there may have been issues or conflict with occupants giving consent to the police to secure, enter, search properties?
I don't recollect at this moment in time, but
Is that the type of information that the Gold Group would wish to have brought to their attention?
well, it depends what the conflict is and what the conflict's about. The goal is more focused on the strategy, making sure that we deliver on that strategy, and as I said, we stabilise and make sure that we don't lose anything. So I wouldn't expect a huge level of detail, but about the detail of every single house. If we did that, the goal group would be extended for hours. So, and we want people to get on with their work. So it should be, and of course we will get some more detail than we expect, but it should be sharp and focused, telling us what they're doing, and then get on with it.
And you say it depends what the conflict would be about. Can you think of any examples where you would, as a Gold Group, expect to have conflicts or issues brought to your attention?
I can't think of an example at this moment in time, but
Right.
no, sorry.
Thank you. Again, I understand that the chair would perhaps wish to rise at the moment. I wonder if you could give me just a moment to speak to the chair and see what he wants to do at this precise time. Thank you. I'm wondering whether you would wish to rise now for the remainder of the afternoon.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Nicolson, if you return tomorrow to continue with your evidence, the inquiry will now adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you.